Hi, I'm Hermes. I'm here at SAJE with the LA Housing Movement Lab team. Azhar, who is the organizer and coordinator with LA Housing Movement Lab, and Sonia, who is the assistant director with LA Housing Movement Lab. So kind of want to ask y'all, like, if you could please explain what LA Housing Movement Lab is and what type of work y'all are doing.
Sure, yeah. So the LA Housing Movement Lab is a space for housing justice organizations across LA County to come together to strategize and think long-term about what we need to decommodify housing in LA County. And we have 5 long-term movement goals that we use to guide our work. The first is around changing the cultural narrative around housing. The second is around building up the people power, so building up the capacity for us to do this work of decommodification. The third goal is around a set number of units we want to decommodify, so we want to try to decommodify 20% of LA County by 2050. Our fourth goal is around pushing back against corporate landlords, so we want to try to eliminate corporate landlords and eliminate their will to extract wealth and profit from our communities. And our fifth goal is around social safety nets. So it's around everything else that people need to really thrive in the city, things like healthcare, access to union jobs, access to good transit. And so, yeah, those are the goals that kind of guide us in our work.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit onto that, the LA Housing Movement Lab has 50 members across 20 or so different organizations. And those include base building organizations, policy and advocacy organizations, legal services. We even have some affordable housing developers. So there's quite a variety of different folks who are coming together in this space, and we're all building sort of a shared framework and alignment around what we do need to decommodify housing and achieve those other long-term movement goals that Sonia mentioned.
Nice. So it's a big group then. I mean, we hear this concept of decommodified housing, being thrown around. Can you all explain a little bit more what that means?
I think it's important context to first think about what commodified housing is before we jump into decommodified housing. So most people in Los Angeles and across the United States live in a commodified housing system. And so what that means is that a small group of wealthy people control most of the housing, and they manage it, rent it, or sell it in order to make profits. So the housing system is built on creating profits for a small group of wealthy folks. And because of that, it also creates really poor conditions for everyday tenants who are living in those in corporate housing. So we have poor housing conditions like roaches, leaks in the roofs, high rents and fees, evictions, foreclosures, landlord harassment. These are just a few of the issues that people are facing under commodified housing systems. And the reason that they face these kinds of issues is because oftentimes landlords are not willing to repair or do adequate work to make sure that tenants are living comfortably, and that's because that requires funding, and they're trying to make money, so that's an expense to them, right? So a commodified housing system, things that actually make tenants' lives better are treated as expenses, and they can't really come to thrive. And just for context, 75% of LA tenants, people who rent in LA, live under corporate landlords. They live under people who are extracting money and making profit off of housing. And so I think that's just really important context in order to understand what decommodified housing is. You want to talk a little about decommodified housing?
Sure. So building off of that, when we say decommodified housing, what we mean is housing that's really community-centered and is not for profit. And that can look like a lot of different types of models of housing. That can include things like social housing. It can include things like co-ops. It can include things like subsidized housing by the government. So there's really a range of ways that we can decommodify housing. It's kind of like an umbrella concept. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those concepts too.
Yeah, and thank you, for explaining decommodified housing. I know that that's kind of something that for some folks, it's a new term, right? But it has been thrown around a lot. And so, yeah, thanks for the explanation. And I kind of want to know a little bit more about, like, in this term or in this, in this context of decommodified housing, what is social housing? And kind of like, what also, like, what's the importance of this social housing?
Yeah, so like you said, it is a newer term, and for some people it can bring up different ideas. Here in the US we don't really like to hear words like socialism or social paired with some kind of government service, but For us, what social housing really means is a couple key things. One is that it's permanently affordable. So that's not always a guarantee in our current system of housing. You might live in something that's technically affordable, but you don't know for sure if it's going to stay affordable. So permanent affordability is something really key. The second thing is that it's in some form of community or public ownership. So this is kind of getting back to that concept that we want to take ownership out of the hands of corporations and bring it back to the people, to our communities. A third thing is that there's some way for tenants who are living in the building to have some sort of governance or some sort of say in the management. So it's really transferring that ownership of what happens in the building, giving people back that agency to have some sort of control over their living situation.
I see. And would you say that, when it comes to the social housing, it's important because, it kind of helps, alleviate some of that like corporate consolidation of housing?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that an important framework here is this community control aspect, right? When you have, that's a really big part of social housing, is that tenants are managing or have a really direct say in the way their building is managed, if not managing it themselves. And it really feeds into this notion that housing should be a human right. It should be something that is like created for people to live in, not for people to profit off of. And so when you talk about something like the corporate consolidation of housing in LA, what you're really seeing is corporations that are buying up property and land, not to support and create housing that is going to allow for our communities to thrive, right? What you're seeing is them looking at investments and looking at ways in which they can extract from our communities and ways that they can, maybe it's not intentional. You don't want to, maybe not all corporations are bad actors, but at the end of the day, the model of commodified housing and the model of consolidating housing under corporations creates a system in which they're not incentivized to spend money to support tenants. They're not incentivized to do the best job that they can. And so when you have tenants who are managing the buildings, not corporate landlords, there is, people are going to spend money and they're going to spend their rents where they need to spend it. And they're not going to raise rents unaffordably high. They're not going to harass one another, right? Like tenant managed housing really means community autonomy, like collective decision making around what housing can look like. It means taking housing away from these corporations and giving it to the communities that are living in them. And so it definitely has a really, strong relationship to the consolidation. And what we're trying to see is a movement away from consolidation of corporate housing and bringing, ownership of land and housing to the people that live there. So.
Okay, so we see the importance of social housing and like people having ownership of their not only their homes but also like their neighborhoods, their areas, right? And obviously that could work in a lot of ways to combat gentrification and different types of urban colonization, as I like to say. But what are some of the models of social housing that currently exist here in LA as well as globally? If y'all have any examples, and also what are some of the models that would like to see more of?
In the U.S., we have a couple models that could be considered social housing. So we have community land trusts. So a community land trust is a type of housing where the community owns the land and rents out or sells units that sits on that land to community members. So the housing is kept permanently affordable because the land is always held by the community. It's usually held by an organization that is called a trust that makes sure that will always be affordable. So that's one model that we have. It currently exists in LA, but it's underfunded, so we need to push for more funding for community land trusts. And they also need a lot more capacity to really scale up that model. So we need to think about how are we funding more people to work for community land trusts? How are we training residents and tenants to live in that kind of community together? So we really need to think about like putting more investment into the model of community land trusts. We also have a couple of examples of co-ops. Do you want to talk about the co-ops?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the one largest and probably most successful that we can look at is the LA Eco Village, which is housed under the Beverly, Vermont Community Land Trust. and that's in Koreatown. And yeah, I was actually just there the other day to sort of grab some interviews from folks on what tenant management looks like in practice, and what collective decision making looks like. And yeah, it's a really beautiful space. They have decided that as a collective, as a community, they decided, oh, we want to have green space. So they have green space, right, in the center, and all of their units open up to that green space. They have a bike room. They have a community tool shed. They have things that are almost unimaginable in the context of like a commodified housing context. In a situation where you have a typical apartment building, this is a space. They all have their own units, but they come together. They dedicated 2 units to a community space for meetings. They have a beautiful lobby. The rent has been kept affordable for almost 23 years. The rent has almost very little changed in that time. And the only time that they have raised rents is to fund their own work and to fund their own projects. So they decide when to raise their rent and not someone else. It's a really powerful model that I think we can learn a lot from as we're hoping to create more co-ops and community housing, tenant managed housing in the city. And yeah, I think one final thing that I'll say about it is just like the way that people raise families in that context. It just looks so different. Kids that have support systems from their community members because all the neighbors know each other and they make decisions about the property together. There's a lot of pressure a lot of times these days to have the mom and the dad be the sole support system, or parents be a sole support system for children, and that's not the case in the Eco Village. They have a situation where the community supports in the child rearing, and it's just really beautiful to see the kind of love and energy that can be poured into children in these contexts. So I think there's just a lot that we can learn from the Eco Village in terms of like what kind of future do we want to see for housing more largely and for community more largely in LA. And I think this notion of decommodified housing and social housing has a lot of potential to transform lives. Something that, just the last thing I'll say on this. One of the leaders at the LA Eco Village who helps support tenant management there and facilitate that process, they mentioned that since they moved in, their mental health, their physical health, their community, like their social life, like all of these things have improved drastically. And I think that just really speaks to how social housing isn't just a model that is going to allow us to be, creating more affordable housing that supports frontline communities and working class communities. It's also something that really genuinely improves people's lives at a social and a community level. And the potential for that is huge. And recognizing that this is something that we have a lot of potential to create more of in the city.
Sounds great. And I'm just like, it'll be amazing to see a lot of these different types of, or this type of model of housing, right? Like exist a lot more in LA. I know that Sonia, you and a lot of people with LA Housing Movement Lab also went to Vienna to explore a bit more about social housing too. I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit about that and what you learned there.
Yeah, so going to Vienna was really inspiring. The way that they do social housing there, there's definitely a lot of lessons that we can take back and bring here, but some of the most kind of big takeaways for me from learning about their model of social housing was the amount of government investment that the government really prioritizes putting money into housing. So not just building new housing, but also preserving the existing affordable housing. They also have a lot more vouchers available. So if folks can't afford rent, they have vouchers that are more readily available to get into units. The government is way more involved in making sure the people that need housing get placed into housing. So there's a central agency that coordinates who gets put into social housing. That same agency also offers eviction defense services, offers legal services to tenants, also offers legal services to landlords. There's another agency that's in the government that provides conflict resolution for folks who are living in a co-op situation. They also do community building, so there's a lot more investment, not just in the building and preservation of housing, but in all aspects of what it takes to really create an intentional, healthy community of people living together. In Vienna, leases are often permanent and inheritable. So that means that once you sign a lease, you are locked into it for as long as you want, or you can also leave whenever you want, but you can't be evicted, essentially. They have a couple different systems of rent control to keep rents affordable. And you can pass your lease on to a family member once you pass. So in those ways, they offer a lot more stability to renters. So they still have home ownership in Vienna, but they have far more rental opportunities and far more renters. And renters feel a lot more stable because they know that they can't be evicted, they know that their homes are going to be staying affordable, and they know that they can pass their homes on to their family members. So they're providing a lot of that security that we don't necessarily have for renters there. So there's a lot of takeaways for tenant protections that we can also think about implementing here, because they have like a really kind of robust system that thinks about, like I said, not just building and preserving, but also everything people need to really feel safe and secure in their housing.
Like, it sounds like they're a lot more protected.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes,
They
of
also,
course.
in addition to all of that, they also have a really extensive social safety net in other ways. So they have free childcare. Most of the public higher education institutions are for free. And yeah, they have just a lot more support all around for people. So people feel really, like if there's a crisis in your life, people, like what we heard anecdotally is that most people know that they'll be able to rely on some sort of government service. So there's no fear for like if something happens, and they don't, place as much of their hopes in like things like home ownership for like wealth building, because they have other social safety net systems that they know will support them.
I mean, that would be a really good, cushion to have, like the safety nets. I know that's something we're working on here, right? Like, not just in LA, but also statewide. And on that note, I actually wanted to know what are some of the policies that we're, LA Housing Movement Lab is trying to, lobby for statewide and locally?
Sure, yeah. So statewide, there are 2 social housing bills that we are advocating for. One is SB 555. This would create a social housing plan, and it has set number of goals for the state to accomplish. So the state by next year would have to create a plan for how to get to a certain number of social housing units in 5 years and then in 10 years. It also creates a fund for to actually fund these units. And then the other bill is SB 584, which is similar in the way that it defines social housing. It doesn't use those words. I believe it calls it labor force housing. And this bill has some of the same tenets, but it actually includes a funding mechanism. So it would generate funding through a tax on short-term rentals. So those 2 bills together would be pretty complementary. So one would kind of fund the social housing, another one would create a plan for how we can actually build it.
Yeah. And I know I've also heard about like the CLT TOPA, right? That's happening here in LA.
Locally.
Yeah. So if you could explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can talk about the CLTs, and I can also talk about ULA, which is a big one.
Yes.
But, so locally, we have the LA CLT Coalition, which is a group of CLTs who have been working really hard over the past few years in LA to organize together, and they successfully have gained funds from the county for each of them to buy their own building. And in order to make that process easier for CLTs to buy buildings, we need a policy called TOPA, and TOPA stands for Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And essentially what TOPA would do is it would allow tenants to be able to have the first, make the first offer if their building is being sold. So usually what happens these days, if your building's being sold, you often don't know until it's too late. So it's essentially creating some more transparency in the building sales process. So tenants would have the opportunity to make the first offer for the sale. They would also have time built in to organize. So it kind of creates this opening for tenants to be organized and be able to buy their own buildings if they know it's being put up for sale. So that would be a really important tool for the CLTs to have. Since they're already organizing people, they're already looking for buildings, this would really create that opportunity for them to buy buildings with supportive tenants they're organizing. And do you want to talk about ULA?
Sure, I can talk a little about it. Maybe you can fill in some of the gaps. Sonia is the policy expert when it comes to this stuff, but I
just
have
felt like I
these
was talking a
spaces.
lot.
But yeah, I can talk a little bit about ULA. So Measure ULA was passed 2022, end of 2022.
Yes. Yeah. I was like, what year? It's 2023 right now.
Yeah,
yes.
end of 2022.
Yeah.
So ULA was passed end of 2022, and ACT LA played a big role in coordinating that. There were organizations, not just from the housing justice world, but from honestly across the different social justice avenues and aspects of LA. And all these organizations, community-based organizations, came together to get this passed. And essentially, it is a 5% tax on all properties that are sold over $5 million.
So it's a large pot of money, much larger than we've ever had access to in the city, and it'll go to a variety of different housing programs. This will include new production of housing, and it'll also include renter protections. So there's kind of two main pots. And then within the housing production, 22.5 to 25% will go towards alternative models. And what we mean by alternative models is social housing. And so the ACT LA Coalition has been coordinating this campaign around social housing using that bucket of funding. And so that'll be for the new production of actual social housing. There's also a bucket of funding for acquisition and rehab, and that is money that will potentially go towards the CLT Coalition to buy buildings and then rehabilitate them, and they could turn them into CLTs. And then the last thing I'll mention about ULA is there's another bucket of funding that's about 8%, and that'll go towards capacity building. And a big part of that is creating something called the Hub, which will be a tenant resource center. So it'll be for tenants who are starting to own or manage their own properties collectively, to have access to resources and training to help support them as they're developing these communities together, using these funds from ULA to create social housing or potentially CLT properties. So the Hub is a really big piece of this tenant management aspect, and like we said earlier, a key component of social housing is that governance and that democratic process that tenants are able to have agency over their own homes. So the Hub is going to be a really important resource, not just for ULA, but for decommodified housing in general, as we are pushing this model forward.
Yeah, officially now in Los Angeles, money is being collected if any properties are sold over $5 million. 5% of that will go into this fund. There is some litigation that's happening from larger corporate landlords, the Apartment Association of Los Angeles. And so, there's still a fight to be had in terms of actually getting ULA to be implemented. But it's a really cool opportunity for us to actually construct social housing. It's not just like some pipe dream. There's money, and we are actively building out things like the Hub that are going to support us in creating social housing and decommodifying housing across Los Angeles. Did I miss anything in that?
One thing I'll just add about ULA is that it also funds vouchers, and so if you need emergency vouchers, it funds that. It also funds different tenant protections. It funds a right to counsel. It funds tenant anti-harassment. So it provides a lot of tenant protection funding, as well as funding for housing, actual structures. It also funds keeping people housed.
Okay. Yeah, and for folks that don't know, right to counsel is essentially making it a right to have legal representation if tenants were to go to eviction court. And then anti-harassment, right? What you're referring to when you say that is funding to the mediation, right, of solving harassment issues between landlords and tenants.
Yeah.
So it's great, that we passed, we voted. LA decided we want to measure ULA. I know that there's that fight going on with the Apartment Association or AGLA, right? But aside from that, how is it that folks could get involved in this type of work? Get involved with the work that LA Housing Movement Lab is doing, to create social housing here in LA.
Well, you can follow the LA Housing Movement Lab on our socials. I think it's just at LA Housing Movement Lab, right? Yeah. And we also have a mailing list that you can sign up for on our website. And then if you want to get more involved with the ACT LA social housing campaign, we can share a sign-up link
Yeah, and I think also at the LA Housing Lab we'll probably be we had a political education, popular education session pretty recently on social housing, and sort of just we're in this phase of like building capacity, and so definitely coming out, getting informed, having like a strong understanding of what is decommodified housing, and talking to your friends and family about it, and really trying to shift that cultural narrative, because there will be more fights to get decommodified housing in Los Angeles. There will be more of a need for people power and mobilization across the city as we get further into this. So I think just recognizing that, and there will be more opportunities to get involved. So just staying informed as much as possible is a really critical thing you can do right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for sharing about LA Housing Movement Lab and how we can get social housing and are getting social housing here in LA. So with that, I'll leave y'all. And so thank you, for watching this video.
Thanks.
Thank you.